Imagine waking up in the morning and finding the iron bed in the next room completely twisted. Iron bent like paper. And the person who slept there, covered in deep scratches and cuts all over their face. This went on for over 50 years with a man who developed bleeding wounds on his hands and feet, could appear in two places at once, and once saved an Italian general's life by materializing out of nowhere inside his locked office when the man was about to end everything. When he died, every clock in the convent stopped at exactly 3:30 in the morning. And 40 years later, when they opened his coffin, the body was intact, as if he had died just yesterday. This is the most disturbing story you'll hear today, and every word of it is true. There are people in this world who develop abilities that science simply can't explain. Individuals who manifest supernatural powers and become targets of forces most of us don't even know exist. Francesco Forgione, known as Padre Pio, was one of those extraordinary cases. For 50 years, he manifested bleeding wounds on his body that should have killed him, battled supernatural creatures night after night, and showed the ability to materialize in distant places. Have you ever stopped to think that maybe there are people with paranormal abilities living among us? People who've developed powers that defy everything we know about reality? Because the more I research this case, the more I believe Padre Pio was exactly that. And the events I'm about to share are so impossible, they'll make you question the very limits of what we call real. Like the time he materialized in a locked room to stop a general from taking his own life. Or when a possessed woman revealed details of violent attacks he had suffered. Padre Pio arrived at the San Giovanni Rotondo convent, already showing unusual behavior. He would spend up to 12 hours straight in the confessional, following an obsessive routine that seemed to drain his energy for something greater. But it was at night that the truly paranormal phenomena would begin. In the early hours, the other friars would hear impossible sounds coming from his room. These weren't normal noises. It was like a full-on physical battle was happening in there. Furniture being slammed with unnatural force, glass shattering, screams echoing through the hallways. And here's the strangest part. Padre Pio asked the other friars to leave him alone during those episodes. He would say, "Lock the door and don't come in until I call," as if he knew exactly when the phenomena were about to begin. Imagine being one of the friars, standing outside that door, listening to hours of intense paranormal activity, knowing that someone inside was facing something terrifying, completely alone. Until around 3 in the morning, always at that eerie hour, you'd finally hear an exhausted voice from within. "Someone help me." When they finally opened the door, the scene was always devastating. The room completely wrecked, furniture broken and scattered, and the iron bed, pay attention to this, was completely twisted. Solid iron bent as if some paranormal force had toyed with it. And Padre Pio was always injured. Deep, bleeding scratches, cuts on his face, bruises all over his body. But he never explained in detail what actually happened during those episodes. One time in particular, he showed up with a dangerous cut on his forehead, right near his eyes. When the friars, alarmed, asked what had happened, he gave an enigmatic reply. "They tried to rip out my eyes, but they couldn't." And you know what shocks me the most? The next day, during a public ceremony, something happened that proved those experiences weren't hallucinations. During communion, a woman who seemed completely normal suddenly entered an altered state of consciousness. Her voice changed, deep and threatening, and she screamed in front of the entire congregation. "Yesterday, I couldn't take your eyes, but I still will." Then, she went back to normal, with no memory of anything. But everyone heard it. Everyone saw it. It was as if the entities attacking Padre Pio were now manifesting through other people. Guys, I can't help but wonder how the other friars managed to sleep knowing this happened every single night right next door. But if you think this part is already disturbing, just wait until you hear about the forms those entities took to torment him. Padre Pio said these entities manifested in different forms, always trying to scare or confuse him. Sometimes it was an abnormally large black cat, with eyes that glowed in the dark like burning embers. Other times it was a monstrous dog with a deformed face, resembling the gargoyles from Gothic cathedrals. But what disturbed Padre Pio the most were the times these creatures tried to deceive him by taking on familiar forms. They would transform into figures he recognized, attempting to lower his psychic defenses. Fortunately, he had developed a sharp paranormal sensitivity. He could immediately tell when he was facing a disguised entity. One of the most remarkable encounters happened on a night of intense heat. Padre Pio couldn't sleep and stepped out onto the balcony for some air. When he looked up at the roof of the convent, he saw a creature crouching up there. He described it as something like a gargoyle with a horrifying face. The entity was watching him, studying his movements like a predator. By instinct, Padre Pio dropped to the ground, taking a defensive posture, and began using mental techniques he had developed. The creature leapt from the rooftop, straight onto the balcony where he stood. And then, he heard something that sent chills down his spine. Multiple voices whispering at the same time. "It's him! It's him!" As if several entities had finally located their primary target. But Padre Pio continued using his psychic defense methods until the presences finally backed off. It was as if he had developed a kind of mental resistance they just couldn't break through. Man, when I read about the forms these creatures took, I started getting scared of every black cat I saw on the street. But now comes the part that gave me the biggest chills during my research. The day he had a conversation that simply should not have been possible. Now comes one of the darkest and most fascinating parts of this case. Remember how I said Padre Pio used to spend 12 hours in the confessional? It was a strange compulsion he developed, as if he were fulfilling some kind of paranormal mission. One day, a person walked in, completely normal looking, even attractive. Nothing about them raised any red flags. But when they started describing their experiences, it was stuff way beyond the realm of normal. Crimes and atrocities no human being should be capable of committing, or even imagining. During the conversation, Padre Pio noticed the person's voice slowly starting to change. It became colder, more threatening, losing all traces of natural human tone. Then the person said something that made Padre Pio instantly realize he wasn't dealing with a human at all.
"How could someone who did what I did ever be forgiven?"
With all his experience in paranormal phenomena, Padre Pio decided to test the entity. He said, "Anyone can be forgiven. Just repeat after me. Long live Jesus, long live Mary," twice. At the exact moment he spoke those words, the figure vanished from the confessional. It dematerialized right in front of him, leaving behind only a strong chemical smell of sulfur. Padre Pio had just had a conversation with a non-human entity that could take on a flawless human form. And do you realize what that means? These creatures don't just exist. They can fully infiltrate our world, walking among us. Man, imagine finding out that the person you just spoke to wasn't even human. I wouldn't sleep for weeks. But Padre Pio didn't just have these dark encounters. He also manifested a power that defies all known laws of physics. But Padre Pio didn't just have the ability to confront supernatural entities. He also developed an extraordinary power that only a handful of people in history have ever claimed to possess. He could physically materialize in two places at the same time. And I'm not talking about vague or poorly documented claims. I'm talking about events with multiple eyewitnesses and solid physical evidence. The most incredible case involves General Luigi Cardona, an Italian military commander who had a complete psychological breakdown. After a catastrophic battle that resulted in around 90,000 deaths and thousands of prisoners, the general was mentally shattered. The trauma was unbearable. One night, completely hopeless, he locked himself in his room and gave strict orders to the guard not to let anyone in under any circumstance. He grabbed his service weapon, determined to end his suffering. At the exact moment he was about to pull the trigger, a man appeared inside the room. He just materialized there, without passing the guard, without opening a door or window. The man calmly took the gun from the general's hands and embraced him, filling him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. After a few minutes, the visitor vanished, just as mysteriously as he had appeared. Completely shaken, the general asked the guard who had come into the room. The soldier, just as confused, swore that no one had passed by him. He had been at the door the entire time and hadn't seen anyone enter or leave. Months later, the general saw a photo of Padre Pio in a newspaper and recognized him instantly. It was the exact same man who had appeared in his room that night. Determined to understand what had happened, he traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo to meet Padre Pio in person. When they finally met, before the general could even explain why he had come, Padre Pio said, thoughtful, "That was a tough night, wasn't it?" Surprised, how did he know? Puzzled, How could he remember something that happened hundreds of miles away? The only possible explanation is that Padre Pio had truly projected his consciousness to two places at once. Guys, I tried to think of a scientific explanation for this, and there just isn't one. Being in two places at the same time goes against everything we know about physical reality. But if you think that's impossible, just wait until you hear about the wounds he developed on his body. Perhaps the most extraordinary and disturbing phenomenon in the case of Padre Pio are the stigmata. Wounds that appeared on his body and remained open for 5 decades. It all started when he began feeling intense pain in his hands, feet, and chest during altered states of consciousness. At first, there were no visible marks, but 3 years later, during a powerful paranormal experience, something happened that completely changed his physical condition. He described the moment himself. Quote, "During a visionary experience, I saw in front of me a mysterious figure who was bleeding from the hands, feet, and chest." Quote, "The vision terrified me, and I couldn't tell what I was feeling inside. I thought I was going to faint. My heart was racing uncontrollably. When the vision faded, I realized my own body was wounded and bleeding in the same places." Close quote. Padre Pio's wounds followed an unexplainable pattern. They would start bleeding every Thursday and stop on Saturday. For 50 consecutive years, every single week, the same cycle repeated with mathematical precision. This got the attention of skeptical doctors who suspected self-inflicted wounds or even fraud. Padre Pio was subjected to intense, invasive medical exams and monitored around the clock. But the results left experts completely baffled.
The amount of blood he lost weekly should have caused severe anemia or even death. The depth of the wounds was incompatible with normal life. Medically speaking, it was impossible to live under those conditions and function normally. Yet Padre Pio maintained a completely normal routine. Full days of activity, intense work, attending to hundreds of people. It was as if the wounds existed in some kind of parallel dimension.
Doctors confirmed the lesions were real, fresh, and there was no scientific explanation for their existence or persistence. Every theory of fraud was ruled out after extensive investigations. Man, imagine developing wounds that bleed every week for 50 years and still living your life like nothing's wrong? And even the events surrounding his death were so filled with anomalies, they left me completely speechless. Padre Pio died on September 23, 1968, at the age of 81. But even his death was marked by events that defy all logical explanation. At exactly 3:30 in the morning, the same hour when he had always manifested his most intense paranormal phenomena, Padre Pio passed away. At that very moment, something impossible happened. The clock in his room stopped. Not only did it stop, it froze precisely at 3:30 and never worked again, despite being repaired multiple times by technicians. That clock is still preserved today as physical evidence of the event, permanently marking the exact moment of his death. And honestly, I thought the strange events ended there. But when I found out what happened 40 years after his death, I was completely speechless. Man, after researching all of this, I keep wondering, could there be people born with a different kind of neurological wiring, people capable of accessing dimensions of reality the rest of us just can't perceive? The case of Padre Pio documents phenomena that current science simply can't explain. Simultaneous materialization in distant places, extreme psychosomatic wounds, physical interaction with unidentified entities, and anomalous preservation of the body. Maybe there really are individuals who act as bridges between our known reality and other dimensions we still don't understand. And maybe these cases aren't as rare as we think. What intrigues me most is this: how many other people around the world are manifesting similar paranormal abilities right now? And how many of those cases go completely undocumented or are never properly investigated? So tell me, did you manage to follow all these impossible events? Padre Pio's case truly challenges everything we think we know about the limits of human reality, doesn't it? Let me know in the comments, have you ever experienced something paranormal you couldn't explain? Have you ever met someone who had strange abilities? I want to hear all your stories. If you enjoyed diving into this mystery, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming cases. And tell me, what other documented paranormal events should I investigate next? Which unexplained stories spark your curiosity?